Nice to meet you.
Hello.
The way that we're going to work with this is that Michelle's going to present some information. Um, I was going to introduce him, but I'm actually going to ask you, Michelle, just to introduce yourself because I find that what you do and where you've been and how you've done it, the journey sounds beautiful, but actually trying to put that into something small, I hope you've had more experience than I have about that. So I'm going to ask you to do just a quick introduction, then do the presentation. And then when it finishes, I'm going to do a round so everybody gets an opportunity to ask a question of Michelle, and then we'll open it up for comments. Any questions at all about how we're going to work? Okay, that's lovely. Thanks, Michelle. I'm sorry I didn't. I promised you I'd introduce you, and then I dumped it on you. But please let us know a little bit.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I thank very much to for the invitation first, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm glad to be, here part of the Credit Commons Society, something that I actually wanted to do for quite a long time, given my particular interest really in alternative monetary systems, financial mechanisms. So very briefly as a background, so I'm originally from Luxembourg, now living in Colombia in South America. And I worked for many years as a researcher at the Center for Alternative Finance at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School. So my role was primarily, or theme was really focused more on digital assets, but given how broad it was, it covered quite a lot of alternative finance grounds, I think. And especially now with CoFi, that's kind of like how I got interested really in the commons because I'm a trained economist. So before that, I was wholly ignorant about the commons, frankly. So yeah, over the last 2 or 3 years, so I've been mostly traveling and really focusing on seeing how can traditional mechanisms that banks, financial institutions are using, like credit clearing, and so forth, how can they be repurposed and really adapted to serve local businesses, communities, and the commons more broadly. And so Sue and I, we met because we are part of let's say, a wider collaborative group called Growing the Commons. So there's also Dave Darby, Katya as member, Dill Green, and so on. And really, a part of that project is that we have a collaborative blog on Substack, and I'm a member of the editorial team for now. And so for new readers, I wrote a 5-part series as a sort of general introduction to the commons, but also introduced some of those financial tools. And one aspect of that series, at one point, I went into, well, what the commons is not. So really focusing on the misunderstandings that are still pretty common. Again, I was guilty of it as well, just like 2 or 3 years ago. And so Sue particularly found that part really interesting, and so invited me to introduce it here as a discussion topic at this meeting. And then I had a look again at the series and actually suggested that it would be, I think, at least from my perspective, more interesting to expand the theme to really focus on the broader relationship between commons, markets, and the state more broadly. Because as we're going to see very quickly, a lot of these common misunderstandings are actually framed as being in opposition to those two other modes. And I'm not really, I do not actually agree with that. So I guess the key question for today I'd like us to discuss is really how might commons successfully collaborate with both markets and the state in various hybrid configurations to really create more resilient and sustainable outcomes. So just some context why this conversation. Well, I think we all know that there's a quite urgent poverty crisis going on, whether we're talking about ecological breakdown, social fragmentation, economic inequality, democratic erosion, you name it. And I think those are symptoms really of a deeper systemic failure. And I think given that here as part of the society, we really focus quite a lot on money, I think we do, or we are probably in agreement that at least one of the root causes is really the design of our current money that we have. and which really creates sort of systemic forces that entrap, I would say, even our dominant institutions. And so those dominant institutions, whether that's corporations, markets more broadly, government agencies, and so on, they are so shaped by this very logic that so far they have been unable to address these challenges. And I don't really see how they on their own could do so, although there is, again, no shortage of initiatives aiming to address any of these, various crises. But just through the fact that they operate within that same paradigm and that they're structurally constrained, I do not really see how they can get us out there. And there's an interesting historical precedent or precedents, if according to Michel Bauwens, what he calls the pulsation of the commons, is that historically, when markets have overreached and governments stood, you could say, kind of powerless as resources were depleted, that the commons has generally resurfaced as a vital correction mechanism to restore social and ecological balance. And I think now again is such a time, and especially with the rise of the internet, telecommunications, as we have more and more technological knowledge commons as they are proliferating. So there's clearly a very renewed interest in the commons. That being said, there's also still a lot of misunderstandings about the commons. Many remain still marginalized, and also often they're really framed as being against something else, often against markets or against governments. And I think kind of the working hypothesis for today is like, what if they actually were complementary and that a healthy society would actually need all three, so blend all three together? So in terms of the common misunderstandings, these are just some that I encountered. And again, you can really see that most of them are framed as being opposition or against or anti something. So I think the most pervasive is probably to be that commons are against markets, against money or profit. Um, I think that's absolutely not the case. Many commons actually use market tools, forms of exchange, different forms of money where appropriate, but those are designed in ways that prioritize circulation rather than accumulation and extraction. And also, when it comes to surplus, this is definitely something that commons not necessarily strive for, but a surplus is either shared by the community and distributed by the community that generated it, or is reinvested in further projects. And all this while taking care that the resource isn't depleted. So I think what people mean by that is that commons are rather against extractive, faceless, distant corporations, against financialized economies that really undermine genuine exchange, that are driving speculation, and opposed really to economic models that rely on continuous growth and extraction, really to generate short-term profits, often with very little or no regards to the social and environmental costs that they leave behind. And similarly, commons are often framed as being against private property ownership. But again, I think there's a lot of different hybrid models that prove that this is absolutely not the case. What people mean is that commons are resisting enclosure. So the process that converts shared wealth into private gain and then prevents or excludes others really from accessing and benefiting from that shared wealth. When it comes against the state and governments, I think in practice, many commons are actually complementing public services. And there's quite a lot of them that actually work in fruitful partnerships with supportive, especially local government. Um, so again, here, I think what most people mean to say is that they're skeptical of these large, again, faceless, distant, centralized bureaucracies that really disempower communities by imposing uniformity from above. And also a point that actually Dave Darby from Low Impact likes to make quite a lot, and which I don't really see that much sort of like publicized, let's say, but I think it's quite important actually, is that commons are really not ideological or partisan, but they're very pragmatic and actually capable of transcending traditional left-right divides, because it really has elements that speak to each of the, let's say, parties on the political spectrum. So I think commons can enable thriving small businesses, decentralized innovation, which really conservatives like. They do embed elements of fair use, access, and redistribution by design, which I think the left finds quite appealing. They do favor localized supply chains, responsible use or ecological stewardship, which Greens definitely value. And also, they try to reduce dependence on centralized state bureaucracies, which libertarians are very fond of. Um, and I think this is a point that's not really sufficiently, I think, marketed in a way. So really, if the Commons want to garner, let's say, greater support and improve it, I think correcting this sort of image or narrative is quite important. And then finally, many people think that it's really sort of like a fixed thing, like fixed broad no, actually narrow category, with a very rigid blueprint. But I think, as we all know, it's more a living social practice that is very, very diverse, very adaptable, and actually constantly evolving according to the context. So what are the three modes that we're talking about? Three distinct logics of provisioning. So how we organize as a society to really meet our needs. The markets, obviously, where access is mediated through prices and money. Then we have the state or government, where access is, you could say, allocated through bureaucracy, through law, through entitlements. And then the commons, where access is really facilitated or guided by community relationships and the rules that those communities are collectively sort of like putting up. So I think the key takeaway for me here is that each mode has unique qualities and characteristics, but also very important limitations. So it's all about, as generally in life, about trade-offs. And so I think it's about recognizing, understanding those trade-offs, and then finding out in what context the best possible trade-off could be found to achieve a particular outcome. So at the risk again of very much oversimplifying, but I think markets can be said to be highly dynamic, very efficient at facilitating exchange, also innovation at scale without relying on centralized coordination or planning, and all of this being coordinated by mere price signals. But I think, as we can see definitely today, but also in the past, if they're left unchecked or explicitly or not explicitly regulated, they also tend to be very extractive, to concentrate wealth, and to overlook the social and environmental damage that they may cause. When we get to governments, well, they can provide universal services, they can redistribute resources, reduce inequality, they offer legal protections and stability, they offer certainty both for business and communities, but they're often very slow to adapt. They're often quite constrained financially, also today, although I guess some MMTers would disagree with that. They operate through distant, convoluted bureaucracies, and also they are very vulnerable, quite vulnerable to either political inertia, as we're seeing in some countries today, or to regulatory capture. And then finally, we have the commons, which is really empowering communities to meet their needs directly. So they are very or highly adaptable, let's say, to local conditions. They promote reciprocity, responsible use, and so forth. But they also require very strong, sustained participation, local capacity, and they do not really scale in the same ways as market or governments. And while all of these three modes can, in principle, be applied across many different domains or sectors, there are certain, let's say, activities that naturally tend to align better with particular logics. But I think crucially, and that's the point for today, they really need not necessarily compete. So the key idea really today is how can we find a good balance between those three? So I think today, and that's really due to developments really over the last, let's say, 40 plus years, markets are without a doubt dominating most aspects of life. So we have a situation where there's one mode that's really dominating at the expense of the others. And it's only when markets fail that we actually turn to government as a sort of last resort. But government, especially today, is very overstretched. Public services are already being hollowed out, and again, low on funding. And the thing is, we have come to so rely on those two modes that we've forgotten the third, the commons. And I think this imbalance really has played a quite substantial role, at least in contributing to many of the systemic failures that we see today. And I believe that the commons can actually fill critical gaps that have been left behind by the market state binary. But to do so, it's actually crucial and imperative that we strengthen the commons and restore it again to former importance as a vital third pillar, but importantly, not to reject the other two, but to complement and moderate or temper the excesses of both. That being said, I think we also need to realize that no single mode can, on its own, really respond to the scale or the complexity of today's challenges and overlapping crises. And so, rather than competing, they can coexist, interact with, and even support one another in hybrid configurations. And we need the key being that it should be done in ways that draw on each other's strength while buffering their respective weaknesses. And so I think really a healthy society and resilient society really only emerges when markets, governments, and commons can work together in these ways. And so it's really about, you could call it an art, I guess, to find the right balance between them. And there is no universal configuration of blueprints. So I think this is something that I would definitely would love to discuss today is like what's according to each different context, what could be different configurations where at least two or three of those modes could work together in a beneficial way. And again, each context being very different. So whether we're talking about sectors, activities, place, culture, so each of that uniquely shapes the balance and the configuration. Um, in terms of like what can such collaboration look like, I think there's already quite a lot of, let's say, interaction and collaboration going on across these different modes. Again, this is by no means an exhaustive list, just to give some ideas. So there's some companies, enterprises, and so on that are embedding commons principles. I think the key word here being generative entrepreneurship, where wealth, knowledge is circulating that are more based on reciprocity, on sharing. And I think there's tools like mutual credit, like use credit obligations or future use vouchers that can actually facilitate that circulation and that sort of reciprocal nature of balanced trade. And I think this naturally leads to a sort of relocalization of trade. So local, regional supply chains, trading networks that keep value circulating locally. And those are generally based around local SMEs, so small, medium sized businesses. And I think especially family businesses that are very strongly in or with strong community ties that are very much locally embedded in the ecosystems already do exhibit quite a lot of typical commons principles. Um, Although many of these are not really commons per se, I think they are very interfacing well with them and actually creating the conditions for new commons too much, whether that's about credit or money or about commoning some aspects of the production process, whether it's inputs or distribution and so on. Um, and of course, there's also a push towards, you know, greater forms of shared ownership models, whether it's cooperatives, mutuals, or as Chris's sort of invention about non-dominium, where really we're trying to align incentives across different stakeholders, organized through a partnership or partnership arrangements, so that really you create win-win-win conditions thanks to revenue sharing agreements that align the incentives of essentially completely different, otherwise adversarial classes of stakeholders, whether that's investors, whether that's the managers or the users. Then there's also, some of you might be familiar with Michel Rauchs and his framework about commons-based peer production ecosystems, where he distinguishes between three, you could call them again stakeholder classes. So first being the productive community, which are the contributors that actually produce the shared resource. These can be paid or volunteers. Then you have the commons-based entrepreneurial coalition, which really create added value through products and services that are emerging around or on top of the common resource, thereby often increasing really its sort of appeal and providing and generating funding that then provides livelihoods for the contributors or some of the contributors. And I think here again, the key question being, is the relationship between the productive community and the coalition, is it generative or is it extractive? And then I think in Chris's framework of non-dominion, it would be called the custodians. So Michel Rauchs calls it for benefit associations. So these are really the independent governance institutions that support the infrastructure of cooperation, and really serving as the commons guardians. And I think interestingly here, those could also be public sector institutions, whether that's in a more distant sort of like level, universities that are providing the hosting infrastructure for many, for many, technological commons, for example, or whether that's actually local municipalities and so on. And then finally, we have the partner state. So trying to embed commons principles more into actual public policy. And really the key is to make governments realize or recognize that communities and commons-based initiatives can be legitimate partners in managing public resources. And so this is really about developing frameworks that institutionalize collaboration, and integrate those principles into policy, regulation, but also procurement. So really creating an enabling policy environment at all levels. Um, I think we can discuss some of these, so I don't want to go into much more detail here. But I think really the key to take away here is being governments as enablers, not controllers of the commons. And I see really the biggest leverage points being those institutions that are closest to the citizens, so the municipalities and the city councils. Um, so just before I finish, just one last thing. I think that I've encountered quite a bit, not only in the commons movement, but just like generally, especially again, I was very much before in digital assets and crypto, where you have a lot of different factions that over time sort of like become very narrowly minded, very rigid, creating fixed boundaries. And I think just based on sort of like the framework we're working with here, that we're talking about three different modes, each of them actually being already within internally very diverse. So each really embeds a very rich internal spectrum with lots of different shades. Now, if you all blend these together, well, naturally you're going to have some very, very, curious hybrids that don't really neatly fit any particular category. And I think this is really something, this diversity is something to be celebrated, rather than rejected on sort of like, ideological grounds. Um, because I think if we look at natural ecosystems as an inspiration, I think mixed ecosystems are definitely stronger. They're more resilient and more adaptable. And this is exactly what we're looking for. Now, that's not to say that it's not useful to think about future pathways towards, we could call it greater mutualization, whether that's, conversions towards more shared forms of ownership or exit to community planning. But I think it's crucial not to start necessarily with this like as a sort of like, abrupt, forced, um, what's the term for it? Sort of like starting point, but to allow the things to form. And then over time, understand that this can be a gradual transition process that's shaped by the particular context, the culture, the timing. So not be too rigid in the thinking. And I think that also applies to collaborating with adjacent movements, that share very similar values and aims. I think it's better to be inclusive, collaborative, or at least trying to be pragmatic, open to experiment and learn rather than alienating them, because it's always better to have allies. So with that, just closing it up. Here's some prompts maybe for the discussion, but I think yeah, I hand it over to Sue, and thank you for listening.